How is the board elected of the World Health Organization?
Oh, it's non-democratic. I don't know the exact details, but essentially we know Bill Gates is the biggest funder because he also effectively owns Gavi, another huge funder. So between the two, Gates and Gavi, same thing, that's the biggest single flood of money. And the key thing is that the governments also fund, but the government's funding is not really relevant because the governments don't lobby, right, for tyrannical outcomes from the WHO. So essentially the big money and the real lobbying all comes from Gates and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. So when you say who elects, they can print out how they elect, but it's kind of irrelevant because you know the way big institutions work, they follow the green, they follow the money. So they'll essentially elect whoever the oligarchs indicate they would favour being elected. And interestingly, the European Union, I interviewed an amazing guy, God, his name escapes, Professor Richard Werner, incredible knowledge. And in the interview, it came up about the European Commission. And I said, look, it's basically like, you know, it's completely non-democratic. And he said, but you know what the European Union and Commission are based on pretty much totally? And I said, what? He said, the Soviet Union, the failed Soviet Union. And Soviet historians have commented on this. So you have the European Commission, unelected, influenced by big money and deep state. That's the Commission. That's the equivalent of the old Politburo, the party in the Soviet Union. And then you have the European Parliament, right? But it's a talk shop. It has no power. And yes, the Soviets had a parliament for people to talk, but it had no power. So the WHO, the UN, and indeed the European Union are all totalitarian by their very nature, unelected and influenced by people who essentially want to manage the world, to keep us all safe. But really it's power and money. Power and money, same as always.
I need to ask a question. So who would you consider to be the employer of the WHO? In other words, the employer will have a certain amount of influence, I would imagine. So who would you consider to be the employer?
Okay, so I'm going to flick to the very end of the story for that one. So in 2019, an enormous thing happened. So the World Economic Forum, which is basically, essentially a fascist organization because it's the combining of corporate and state to run things. And that was Mussolini's definition of fascism, the alliance of corporate and state. Well, the WEF, with all the corporates funding it, and all the bad guys, and again, WEF was set up by Rockefeller, right, back in '71, the European Management Forum. So it all goes back to the same oligarchs, but the WEF made an alliance with the UN to apply and fund the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, right? So the UN and the WEF in 2019 quietly made a pact, and the WEF would use corporate and other monies from oligarchs to fund the UN. The WHO is the subsidiary of the UN. So essentially, who runs the WHO de facto? Well, it's WEF, the whole Rockefeller empire, CFR, Council of Foreign Relations I mentioned, the likes of their agents and global leaders like Bill Gates, who acts as an agent for them, and Gavi, etc. So it's kind of like a conglomerate of oligarchies, and that largely together tells the UN and the WEF which way to go, I would say.